All right, this is Jack Yates, Master's of Science in Marketing, graduate student. Remember to do that first this time. And I spent a lot of time today on psychedelics, huge interest of mine, one of my learning paths. And this session, which is was my fourth session of the day, was a panel session on psychedelics called Psychedelics in the Media. I was really torn between going to this or a different session, but I ultimately chose it because, I come from a media background. I've worked in it. I have degrees in it. I have come from a media family. So I was really interested in it. And it was a really cool session. One of my favorites of the day, actually. And it was led by 4 people. Her name was Carly Dutch Green. She ran a podcast called Psychedelics, and she ran some other stuff, but I'll talk about that in a little bit. This other guy named Cesar Marin, who runs a podcast, they all run the podcast currently, called Cultivating Wisdom, but he also worked at CNN for like 20 years or something. He was really cool. He was honestly my favorite. This woman named Alexandra Plesner, who was a designer who was from, according to her, like a super, super, super small secluded town in the Austrian Alps. She said she used to have to drive an hour to get any source of media. And then this gentleman called Dennis Walker, who was once awarded Influencer of the Year, which was pretty cool, who runs a podcast called My Contrepreneur, which is like a mix of the words mycology and entrepreneur, I suppose. And Dennis sort of worked... While he was definitely one of the panelists with like information to share, he sort of worked as the moderator as well for the event, which I thought was kind of cool to have like a moderator who actually is like part of it as well, not just there asking questions. But the basic idea of it is how media influences culture and media influences public perception. And what I really liked about it, firstly, is that they didn't spend too much time talking about the past. They didn't talk about movies like Reefer Madness, if you've heard of that one, propaganda and anti-weed movie from like whenever black and white movies were made. They sort of talked about really recent events, and everything that was in the past was like, within the last 2 or 3 years. And basically how we can't trust mainstream media to sort of become the voice to help normalize psychedelics. And that Caesar particularly kept driving home this point repeatedly. The first thing that he would say is that the media has a huge role to play. And all 4 of these people are media creators. I mean, they all have podcasts. But he kept driving home this point of like what I would call the creator economy, my word, not his. But this idea that like, the way he put it, this is a direct quote, is we are the media. Like everything is media, which I agree with. Again, media person sharing this story. But that everyone should be sharing and everyone should be talking, because like traditional news outlets, guy worked at CNN for 20 years, aren't going to talk about this. They're not, they're going to look for stories with like scary wow factors. I mean, the panelists all brought up this story that actually was talked about in the Psychedelic Meetup networking event to me. This recent story about an airline pilot who tried to open the door on an airplane. This happened like 2 days ago, I think, or not 2 days ago, like very recently, within the month for sure. And the whole story was that he took mushrooms 2 days before he tried to do that. And that was a whole smear piece on like, oh, he took mushrooms and he tried to down a plane. And it's sort of like the media creating this horror, scary, spooky story. And the whole point is like, well, there's probably other things going on. You can't just connect the 2 dots without any real evidence. And it was sort of a really good case study on like, how mainstream media is not really going to achieve what we want. They were all very interesting. They were 4 presenters with like impressive, really cool backgrounds. So I'm going to like breeze through this as much as I can. Caesar was obviously my favorite, but this guy Dennis was really cool. He worked in the media industry for a while. I think he mentioned in San Francisco he got to hang out on Alan Watts' houseboat lunch with him, which was pretty cool. And they talked a lot also about this recent interview that this guy named Michael Pollan did on Oprah, which they called him a parachute journalist. like this guy that had done psychedelics like twice recently, and then went on Oprah's podcast and talked about it like he was an expert, which Dennis wrote, I think, a whole article about how like that this guy Michael Pollan doesn't know enough to give the full story of psychedelics, and that it's not necessarily a negative because it is entering the discussion into the more mainstream, but it's not really a positive either because it's not really coming from like a super respected source. And they really also emphasized, all four of them, this idea of, this is my word, case studies, of this idea of that, this is a direct quote, that we have to give people the stories of psychedelics. We, the people, as the media, this is a Caesar quote, saying that like the best way to tell these stories is to give really specific points of where they worked. To quote Caesar again, he said, put it all out there, like be brave about it, share that you do this, let people know that you do this. It was kind of funny. I don't want to talk too much about a previous session, but in the psychedelics meetup, one of the first things someone said to me, I think it was Mary, the girl who found Christianity, she said, you don't look like a person that would be interested in this. I mean, I was wearing a polo and like khakis. And I said, well, you'd be surprised. And, they also brought up this really interesting point of like indigenous inclusion. Dennis mentioned how most of our conversations on psychedelics are rooted in a Western cultural mindset, and how in a lot of countries, even parts of this country, if you go to like peyote shamans, are still very active in the use of psychedelics. But they mentioned South America, particularly parts of South Asia. But Caesar also kind of countered this point by saying like most of the world looks at the United States for inspiration. So like the United States sort of needs to lead the way on like the worldwide cultural revolution of psychedelics, which I thought was a pretty good point. And there, I have so many notes. Sorry, I'm really trying to like choose what to talk about here. And then, so I mentioned this earlier, but another thing that Carly Dutch Green does is she runs something called the Psychedelics Professionals Networking Club, the Psychedelic Professionals Networking Club, which, I am probably going to join. I think they do in-person and Zoom events because I'm really into this idea of like people who take this topic seriously. And I was speaking, they had a Q&A event in the last like 15 minutes of this, and we actually went over time, which was really fun. And I got to ask a question, which I'll talk about in a second. But one of the people who asked a question was like, what about recreation? Like, we can't discount the fact that these are fun, like that's important to talk about too. And it's like, yeah, I guess, but that's not really the point. That's not at least how I view psychedelics. I'm viewing these not as like a source of recreation, but as a tool. These are things that need to be taken seriously and need to be utilized in very specific ways. And like, if you want to take them for fun, like, sure, but that should not be like the main point. And I didn't really like his point. It was interesting also, Alexandra Plesner, the woman from Austria who was like a fashion designer in London now, I believe, says that social media algorithms censor psychedelic content that she posts. Like they pick up on the word psilocybin and decrease her engagements. And she could prove this by saying she gets more engagements on LinkedIn than any other platform when she posts about psychedelics, but less likes because people don't want to be seen liking that kind of content, especially on a platform like LinkedIn, which is more of a professional platform. But the fact that she's getting more likes on a platform that traditionally gets less likes than like Instagram Reels sort of proves that the algorithm is going against her, which I thought was really interesting. Dennis talked about how media literacy is super important, which was very interesting. I'm running out of time here, but my question was basically like, this was mostly to Caesar, like how do you tell the story, the positive attributes of these drugs while also talking about the negatives? Because like psychedelics can be dangerous. You got to know your dosage and how to take them and where you are in the right setting. And if you don't know that, like bad things can happen. And his answer was use education. Education is sometimes the best form of marketing. Sorry, that wasn't in the quote. His full quote is use education and be honest. And Dennis then told this story about a friend who took psychedelics once, got naked, and punched a cop. Great example of like it gone wrong. And it was kind of fun. Caesar, after the thing, gave me this shirt which is Psychedelics and a bunch of crazy letters. But I'm out of time. But it was a great talk.